Y cuando comienza la revolución industrial,
When the Industrial Revolution began, different cases and lawsuits arose concerning whether or not certain deposits had actually been deposits, and bankers should have preserved the tantundum. And here we must distinguish between two legal traditions. The common law tradition, which is of Anglo-Saxon origin, and the continental European law tradition, which has originated from that of Roman law. Unfortunately, as you know, common law develops gradually based on precedent. And when there is a ruling, it serves as a precedent for deciding similar cases that may arise. That is, for deciding them based on the same reasoning, and the process repeats. Well, there was a famous case in England in 1848, the case of Foley versus Hill, which posed the question of whether a banker could legitimately appropriate demand deposits and lend them to third parties. Unfortunately, Lord Cottenham, a well-known English judge, made the error of ruling that a banker could lend to third parties what had been deposited with him, because what he had received was not actually a deposit, but a loan. Keep in mind that judges reach decisions under strong pressure from the specific circumstances of each case, and from the practices they believe to be widespread around them. English common law is too biased toward case law rulings. In other words, judges' decisions, regardless of the doctrinal and theoretical purity of the institution. Above all, it is very dangerous, because if one or two judges are wrong in the beginning, that is enough to erroneously bias all of the decisions that follow, century after century. Take note. Therefore, the case law errors we are commenting on, which originated in the early 19th century, set doctrinal development on a dead-end road throughout the Anglo-Saxon world, England and the United States. Thus, we should not be surprised to find that the financial laxity and most of the financial problems now ravaging the planet originated in the Anglo-Saxon world, because it has been corrupt from a legal standpoint ever since these 19th century case law rulings, in which two completely unrelated contracts were confused with each other, the deposit contract and the loan contract. This common law trend, based on precedent, of confusing the deposit contract with the loan contract, a trend which, I repeat, is long-standing, due to the institution of the depositum confessatum, contrasts with the crystal-clear case law stance taken also in the Anglo-Saxon world on other deposits of a fungible good. For example, those received by American grain depositories, who in the 1860s appropriated part of the grain deposited with them for safekeeping and speculated with it on the Chicago market. This time, judges did issue correct rulings in the corresponding lawsuits, which indicates that the fungible good deposited, grain or wheat, did constitute a deposit, and therefore the obligation of the depository was to constantly keep 100% of the tantundum at the disposal of the depositor. Why, asks Rothbard, were the case law rulings involving this deposit of a fungible good, wheat, doctrinally sound, while the case law rulings involving the quintessential fungible good, money, confused the deposit with the loan? This is a very intelligent question. Rothbard gives the following hypothetical answer. The capacity of the American grain dealers to pressure society and the judicial system must have been much weaker than the capacity of British and American bankers to pressure society and the judicial system. Fortunately, the continental European tradition is much sounder, because it is rooted in Roman law, and Roman law very clearly establishes, as we have already seen, the differences between the deposit contract and the loan contract. In fact, the positive laws currently in force in most European countries, and in Spain in particular, stipulate that any depository who receives a fungible good and fails to maintain a 100% reserve ratio is committing the crime of misappropriation. and specifically in Spanish criminal law, the crime is punishable by 4 years in jail. Bankers are the only economic agents who enjoy the privilege of operating with a fractional reserve. This privilege is expressly included, take note, in Article 180 of the Spanish Commercial Code, which states that bankers, and only bankers, the depositories of money placed on demand deposits, can maintain a reserve ratio of 25%, or 1/4. This reference to Article 180 in force in the Commercial Code has now become obsolete. It is an anachronism, because with the entrance of Spain into the Eurozone, the reserve requirement for banks, as for all private banks in the Eurozone, was reduced to 1% instead of 25%, as established in the Commercial Code. And it is an anachronism because the origin of Article 180 actually lies in the provisions of the banking law enacted at the request of Finance Minister José Echegaray in 1873. Well, José Echegaray, who in fact won the Nobel Prize in Literature, was a great classical liberal, but he was a confused classical liberal. He supported the banking school, free banking. He believed bankers should be free to operate as they choose, even with a fractional reserve. We will consider the debate between the currency school and the banking school later on. The thing is that these misguided classical liberals failed to realize that the prescription they were defending gives rise to the following successive stages: speculation with credit expansion, which in turn gives rise to malinvestment, which later reverses in the form of a financial crisis and an enormous recession. And when those crises and recessions hit, there was no choice but to create a central bank to come to the rescue of private banks and save them. And therefore, much to his regret, Echegaray was obliged to establish the privilege of the central bank, which would be the Bank of Spain as the savior of private banks. In earlier Spanish banking legislation of the 19th century, the reserve requirement was 33%. Alejandro Mon's banking law of 1849 set a reserve requirement of 33%, and was enacted 5 years after Peel's famous Bank Act was passed in England in 1844. Well, this has been a brief look at the history of Spanish banking legislation, and it all shares the following. Eventually, a privilege was granted to allow one group of economic agents, and that group alone, bankers, to operate outside general legal principles with a fractional reserve ratio, which historically began at 1/3, later became 25%, the figure which still appears in Article 180 of the Commercial Code, and dropped to 2% when the euro came into force in Spain, when Spain entered the monetary union. And later, on January 1, 2013, it was reduced even further, to 1%.